Statue of the Sphinx and the Valley Temple. Called the Queen's Chamber, an upper room called the King's Chamber, and 4 shafts which cross the pyramid. But what is exceptional and out of the ordinary? You are at the foot of the pyramid to take a photo. Stop for a moment to think a little. Imagine pushing and pulling a stone this size with 50 other people. Then imagine doing this with a second stone, then a third. You will have to raise them to a height of 5 meters, then 10, then 20, 40, 80, 120 meters. There are 2,300,000 waiting for you like this that will need to be transported and hoisted. It's dizzying. You look to the top, then to the bottom, and you start to reflect. Immediately the thought comes to mind, the Egyptians were crazy. You then learn that a block of granite weighs 70 tons, the weight of 3 loaded tractor-trailer trucks. Then you learn that inside there are 1,500 tons of granite that came from 900 kilometers away. A kind of dizziness takes you. You've only just begun to consider the difficulty, and you are forced to humbly recognize that the mystery of the pyramids is not exaggerated. This is just the base of the statue of Ramses. The theories imply one must also bring this monolith from the other side of the Nile, 200 kilometers away. With which boat? And as if 360 tons is not enough, there is also the Aswan obelisk, 1,200 tons of granite, which awaits them. Here's the kind of crane, and how many it would take to lift it. According to Jean-Pierre Adam, it would take 12,000 men, or 8,000 to 9,000 oxen. It is no longer fiction, but science fiction, or a cartoon, however you like. From the beginning of the plateau to the end, the base of the pyramids is perfectly horizontal, to within 21 millimeters. They dug an 80-meter-long tunnel that descends to a depth of 80 meters into the rock, which is 1.1 meters wide by 1 meter high, with an error of only 1 centimeter from beginning to end. Here is a tunnel of our time. They cut and transported around 130 blocks of granite weighing 12 to 70 tons from Aswan, and they raised them 80 meters high. The pyramid is not built with 4 sides, but with 8 sides in a concave apothem. The pyramid is oriented to the north with an error of 0.05 degrees. According to Egyptologists, the construction lasted about 20 years, meaning 1 block was cut and transported and installed every 3 minutes. It is impossible to pass a sheet of paper between the blocks. Let's continue with other prowesses in precision. The downward tunnel forms an angle of 26.2 degrees. This angle is identical in the ascending corridor. A student's protractor does not display the 0.2 of a degree, but the most impressive remains to come with the South Underground Tunnel and the well shaft 30 meters underground. At first glance, they are ordinary tunnels. The entrance is 79 centimeters high and ends 16 meters further with a difference of only 5 centimeters. How does one build this tunnel with such precision underground? The biggest problem is indeed the CO2. When a worker works, he exhales CO2. This CO2 accumulates at the bottom. If this CO2 is not removed, it remains there for several weeks. It is assured death if he does not go out at once. Suppose they solved, one doesn't know how, the problem of light, the tool to measure precisely, and the hard tool for digging, that they have found the way to evacuate the CO2. The problem remains that it is technically impossible to dig towards the bottom. It would take an arm 2 meters long to reach the bottom. There is no explanation. One more for the road. If we divide the width of the pyramid by half the height, we get pi, 3.14. The golden ratio and pi are also found in the King's Chamber. The facts are there, and anyone can verify them on site or with official documents. These 2 figures and many others are universal constants. Universal constants are the insurmountable borders of our reality, kind of like the rules of a game. Officially, pi was discovered by Archimedes around 287 BC. It's just a coincidence, cry Egyptologists. It's intentional, insists Jacques Grimault. High-level mathematics and geometry, as if by chance. Edelman found a pyramidion in Dakar, which measures 100 centimeters high. The Egyptologists are unanimous. It is by chance there too. So, who built them and how? When we look for the truth, sometimes we take a big detour, and in the end we realize that it was right next door. Instead of looking to the heavens, staring at the stars and imagining aliens, we just had to look down, right under our feet, on the ground. In fact, it is a matter of chemistry and minerals. Here is a simple wooden mold. We mix flaky limestone with white clay called kaolin. Caustic soda is dissolved in water. We mix everything together with a little water. This gives a kind of paste. We pour it into the mold. A few hours later, the paste begins to harden. The minerals bind together thanks to the chemical reaction, which after 30 days gives a real white stone, hard as the covering stones of the pyramid. It is the first concrete of humanity. Today, concrete is a common material, ordinary, but at that time this mixture was noble and expensive. Sodium carbonate comes from natron, a region of Egypt. Hence the symbol in chemistry of sodium Na for natron. Burnt lime is made by heating limestone. When you mix the burnt lime with the sodium carbonate, caustic soda is produced. Kaolin clay is naturally present in limestone in Egypt. This clay limestone is abundant. There are millions of cubic meters. The components are mixed with water and poured into wooden molds. This is how the Egyptians made all the stones. Joseph Davidovits made this discovery in 1989. At the time, he assumed that the stones were molded and poured on site and not cut. He called this process geopolymer. The principle is the same as that of concrete today. Modern cement is made of clay heated at 1,450 degrees Celsius, mixed with water and gravel, producing concrete. The ancients used natron and burnt lime instead of modern cement. This mixture of natron, burnt lime, clay, and limestone at room temperature and in the open air gives the same result as modern concrete. This is geopolymer concrete. The proof is everywhere, in thousands of examples. Joseph Davidovits' theory was refuted and relegated to the background for lack of scientific evidence. Years later, he brought the evidence with chemical analyses. Even with very detailed analyses, the chemical difference between a poured stone, artificial, and a natural stone is almost imperceptible. The result is the same, and it is for this reason that geologists saw nothing. He continued the debate, but Egyptologists are still not convinced, or rather, they don't want to be convinced. In 2006, the Egyptian government made an official statement. The stones are not concrete. Case officially closed. But a simple statement cannot physically transform the pyramid from concrete to cut stones. Davidovits provides paleomagnetic analysis results. Every stone in nature at the time of its formation is magnetized by the Earth. These are chemical analyses carried out under a microscope by Davidovits. Evidence, but they are not enough to convince the public.
In the heart of the pyramid, there is a stone weighing around 2 tons. And inside this stone, there is a piece of wood which it is embedded for eternity. This piece of wood has been there for 4,500 years.
The construction of the pyramid started 4 years ago. We are at ground level. The mold for the first cornerstone is in place. Arranged in Indian file, in African file, the workers pass the buckets one after the other, from the mixing tank to the mold. They pour the white concrete and about 30 minutes later the mold is filled. Today we call this process formwork construction. First, it is necessary to select the construction site. They examine the Giza Plateau. Then they measure the quantity of clay limestone. Depending on the volume of the limestone, they determine the size of the pyramid. Here in Giza, there is white and dark clay limestone. The plan is to make a pyramid with dark limestone for the interior and white limestone for the exterior. At the location of the tunnels and the underground chamber, there was a cavity about 30 meters. The place is chosen. It will be the Giza Plateau. Before starting the pyramid, the Egyptians established a model. 10 million possibilities to make a pyramid. But the Egyptians chose only one, the only one, the perfect one. According to their sacred principles, they laid a base that measures 440 cubits. Then they divided the base by pi, or 140 cubits. That, multiplied by 2, equals 280 cubits. The result is the height of the pyramid. And the apothem divided by half the base equals 1.618. The Egyptians absolutely wanted to integrate the constants pi and the golden ratio. The pyramid became sacred since it was built with the cubit 52.36, the royal constant, and the meter. 4 universal constants were linked together in this building. There was no such thing as chance. 50 centimeters more or less, and pi disappeared from the pyramid. The Egyptologists would have been relieved. Phew, there is no pi. But no, the Egyptians did not make any mistakes. They built a pyramid 280 cubits high and 440 cubits wide. The pyramid is exceptionally precise, to within 1 centimeter. The Great Pyramid is the largest man-made expression of pi and the golden ratio visible on Earth. Water was essential for mixing and needed to be close at hand. It is for this reason that all the pyramids were built by the river. Making concrete and grinding limestone required a lot of water. The Egyptians invented the screw pump, or so-called Archimedes screw. Some historians believe that this method was known in Babylon, 400 years before Archimedes. It was known thousands of years earlier by the Egyptians. The Egyptians dug 3 passages about 10 meters wide. It is easy to dig in soft limestone. In order to route the water and send it to the other side, they installed wooden viaducts in these passages. The cavity was then filled with limestone concrete. The Egyptians had known the equinoxes for a long time. The date is April 13th, 2560 BC, the time 6 hours 3 minutes. The vernal equinox. The sun will rise in a few minutes precisely east. A team is in place with sticks and ropes to be able to align with the sun. They await the first rays. The sun is rising. 3 or 4 Egyptians quickly arrange the sticks and ropes. 5 minutes later, the sun moves, but the first 4 sticks are aligned to the east. The Egyptians had experience with this precision, which they had used in the fields at the banks of the Nile for hundreds of years. The edges of the cavity are transformed into a shallow basin, where the limestone clay, natron, and lime are mixed. Once the mixture is obtained, they open the valves and let the concrete flow to the bottom of the cavity. Fill these natural bowls to then make the underground tunnels. Limestone concrete, once dried, takes on a natural rock appearance. That's why geologists haven't noticed. Everything is ready. The Egyptians wait for the Nile floods to start. The site is divided into 4 teams. 100 workers are waiting near the screw pumps to draw the water up. The other teams are waiting by the pools to mix the materials, and just as many others are at the bottom of the cavity. Sirius rises. A few hours later, the Nile overflows and reaches the foot of the hill. The workers begin to turn the screw pumps. The water rises and flows to the other side. They mix dark brown limestone with natron and lime. At the beginning, they form a dozen African lines. A team digs the soft limestone and a team does the mixing. The other workers line up in African file to carry the buckets from hand to hand. Once the buckets are emptied, they return them in the same way. 260 men are needed for each bucket brigade, a real conveyor belt. The organization is precise and meticulous. They poured the slab of the pyramid 1 cubit east with recesses to pose the cornerstones. The floor is made with limestone and lots of water. The addition of water allows the soil to self-level perfectly. This explains the horizontal precision of the floor to the nearest 21 millimeters. No need for extraterrestrial technology. From the tunnel, they trace the perimeter of the pyramid with ropes and sticks. At 220 cubits, in the middle of the future south face of the pyramid, they put a picket 4 cubits inward. The workers realign themselves with respect to the new point in the center. The first segment of the apothem perimeter is done. They then line up 90 degrees with a wooden angle and do the same on the other side. Same for the other 2 sides. The perimeter of the future pyramid is now drawn, precise to the millimeter in apothem. It is a perimeter of 8 sides which is drawn on the ground with ropes. It is the future shape of the pyramid. Let's go back a few years. A little further, when the Egyptians settled on the banks of the Nile. Long before they discovered a numbering system, they started from the simple principle of 1 to 10 by counting their fingers. Then they counted their toes, plus 10, and thereby appropriated the numbering system of 10 by 10 by 10. It is the same system that we use today. After language, numbering is the second thing humanity learned, long before writing. The numbering system by 10 is for humans the first gateway to scientific understanding of the environment. It is a kind of bridge between the primitive mind and intelligence. The Egyptians observed that the year is made of 365 days plus 1. They cut it into 3 seasons, 4 months each, for a total of 12 months. The seasons were called flood, germination, and harvest. Over the years, they observed a strange phenomenon. Each year in summer, on a specific day, July 14th, a star, the brightest, rose with the sun, and a few minutes later, it disappeared into the light. The same day, the Nile flooded the fields. The floods were fertile, essential to life, to produce food. Egyptians deified this star and called it Sopdet or Septi. It was the star that announced the floods of the Nile. Today we call it Sirius. This phenomenon is called the Heliacal Rising of Sirius. It was the first day of the Egyptian year, followed by 5 holidays. The Nile brought the essential silt for the crops. It is for this reason that this star was sacred to them. The land was flooded for 3 to 4 consecutive months. Work in the fields stopped, and during this time the Egyptians went up into the hills to be on dry land. Well, it was the start of 3 months of vacation. And it was like that year after year for thousands of years. An innocent mind immediately wonders, but what did they do for 3 or 4 months if they couldn't cultivate the fields? The Egyptians did 3 things during these 3 to 4 months of vacation: observe, measure, and note everything. As soon as the Nile returned to its bed, a big problem had arisen. Field limits had disappeared. It was then necessary to retrace the limits of the fields of each peasant and start sowing as soon as possible. And they had to be traced correctly to avoid disputes. Therefore, the Egyptians began to draw straight lines, rectangles, squares, diagonals, circles, and triangles with strings and sticks. Everything was noted on papyrus. It was the beginning of geometry. They understood a fundamental function of nature. Everything is divided or assembled in small equal units. This observation will serve them throughout their discoveries. They also needed a unit of measure to properly demarcate the plots. Geometry is good, but after all, you must measure the lines. They considered the king's foot. The length of the king's foot could be used as a standard. This standard would be multiplied and distributed throughout the kingdom. They considered the feet, arms, legs, and elbows of the king. But there was a problem. This unit was not fixed. There would be no problem during his reign, but all the kings were not the same size. The next king would surely want to use his foot or his elbow out of pride. In the hills, waiting for the retreat of the Nile, the Egyptians thought and looked for a solution to the problem. This unit of measurement would have to have a fixed length in time, if possible, never change. They observed the size of different plants, fruits, seeds, any object in nature. But all these objects did not have a constant size. For example, if we water a seed well, the following year its size will have changed. And over long distances, small differences quickly became significant. Then, they had the idea to measure water. Yes, fresh water from the Nile. They measured one drop and then another. They were all the same size. From the lower Nile to the upper Nile, the drops were the same size. They noticed that the size of the water drop did not change year after year. It's wonderful. The Egyptians found a unique unit. The diameter of the drop of water on a waterproof surface, like granite or alabaster, is constant. It measures 1 centimeter. They were presented as recent discoveries, and the French appropriated them, made in France. The diameter of the drop of fresh water measures what is now called 1 centimeter. Water is a universal constant. The size of the drop of fresh water will never change for thousands and millions of years. Yes, the universal unit, the meter, was not invented in 1780, but it was discovered by the Egyptians millennia ago. The meter is a universal unit because it is measured on water. Water is the only material that is stable. All other materials or objects are difficult to measure, or else they vary over time. The architecture of the entire universe is constructed with this unit. Using the meter, this immutable unit, were defined the 6 fundamental units of physics and chemistry today. Amperes, Celsius, moles, candelas, seconds, and kilograms. So, everything. Now that the Egyptians had discovered the meter, they could trace the plots without a problem. With the meter, they measured everything and recorded everything. They took a disc with the diameter of a royal leg and wrapped a string around it. They unrolled the string and measured it. The parameter of the disc was 3 royal legs and 14 royal fingers, or 314 royal fingers. A disc with a diameter of 10 unrolled corresponded to 31 units and 4 subunits. A disc with a diameter of 1 corresponded to 3 units and to 14 subunits. One number stood out each time: 314, 31.4, 3.14. They thought this number was important. This figure is pi. The Egyptians understood the essence of all things, that God, or the architect of the universe, built nature and all of its components using a matrix called mathematics. They then applied it to themselves, in turn, like gods. They integrated math everywhere, which deeply connected them to nature. This way of building based on universal constants was spread everywhere on Earth over the millennia. Cathedrals, churches, and various buildings were carried out with the cubit, the meter, pi, and phi, which were mystically called sacred geometry. The temples of Angkor Wat are built with the meter and aligned with the equinox. Concrete flowed freely all over Europe and around the world. It is enough to observe the first foundations of the buildings to understand that there never were cut stones. Geometry and construction from Egyptian knowledge was preserved and transmitted in secret. Only a few initiated architects had the privilege of accessing it. Masons applied sacred architecture and Egyptian thought by integrating universal constants in all buildings. The architects of the cathedrals deployed the meter, pi, the golden ratio, and the royal cubit. Totally contradicts the fact that the 3 granite plugs were released from the large gallery. The 3 granite plugs were poured and then stored there next to the entrance. Yes, you heard right. Poured. Poured granite. Official theory says that the obelisk was carved out of the rock with dolerite balls, but that after the rock cracked, it was abandoned. To understand granite, you must touch it. You must try to break it to immediately feel its power. One can feel the fiery depths of the earth, the magma. Natron mixed with lime gives caustic soda. Caustic soda mixed with water and white sand heated to 1000 degrees Celsius produces sodium silicate, referred to as liquid glass or water glass. They mixed it with potassium silicate, obtained by the same process. They poured the liquid into a lens-shaped mold. 2 to 3 days later, they unmolded the transparent lens. A lens that focuses light at one point, a magnifying glass. The larger the lens, the higher the temperature. Everyone can make their own solar lens with the recipe. Have fun. With a 5-meter diameter lens, the temperature reaches 1,800 degrees to 2,000 degrees Celsius. The Egyptians have just discovered solar energy. Everything is melted, nothing can resist. Granite literally melts at once, like lava. The Egyptians poured this lava into clay molds, and here is the famous statue of the 3rd dynasty, Huni, the grandfather of Khufu, in Aswan granite. Vases harder than steel, like these in tracheandesite, dating from at least 3500 BC. Here is how the granite was extracted and what happened with the unfinished obelisk in Aswan. The workers in the Aswan quarry were responsible for extracting the granite in cobblestone-sized pieces. These are small pieces of 30 to 40 centimeters, which were extracted from the molten granite with stone shovels. Once cooled, these pieces were transported by boat to Giza, over 900 kilometers away. When they reached Giza, they were melted again and then poured into clay molds. Here, a ball of dolerite fell in the granite in lava form, and it got stuck there for millennia. Nature does not do that. The melting of the granite was done from May to August. The traces of all the granite extractions are tilted. This corresponds to the best trajectory of the sun. During these months, its intensity is the strongest. The geologist of the tourist group was surprised by the absence of faults, fractures, in natural granite. This is natural, and it is normal, and there is nothing. There are no faults. How is it possible? This is normal, because the molten granite, once cooled, is like new, out of the ground. The workers melted the granite using the lens. Then they began to cut notches and holes in the granite while playing with the solar ray of the lens. This is how the Egyptians melted all kinds of stone: quartz, granite, schist, basalt, diorite, gneiss, greywacke. No luck, they did not come upon ferrous earth. Otherwise, they would have discovered steel. Solar energy was fully deployed. Queen Hatshepsut in Karnak writes that her obelisk was completed in 7 months. This is entirely possible with the lens. The Egyptians mined copper for thousands of years in the Sinai mines. Copper is a very soft material used to make pans that were used to make the silicate-making mixture. The evidence that the granite was cast with solar lenses could possibly be found in the archives of the Vatican, Paris, London, and Cairo. On the stones, one can see the imprint of an external object that was placed on the stone when it was poured. The concentrated ray sometimes burned stones due to an error in handling the lens. The same technique was used in Tiwanaku, the Sun Gates, and the Temple of Kalasasaya. Andesite melted into lava, then poured into molds. The theory supported by some researchers explaining that the stones were melted, then vitrified by a solar plasma is false, since the surroundings were not affected. In 2018, Joseph Davidovits published the chemical analyses of the stones of the Gate of the Sun, Tiwanaku, and Pumapunku.
To the following conclusion. The thin section of a sample taken from a Pumapunku red sandstone monument shows grain boundaries made of a thick fluidal ferrosilate matrix. To our knowledge, this feature is very unusual in sandstone formed geologically. It is a unicum and supports the idea of artificial sandstone geopolymer concrete.
Davidovits' analyses show that the composition of the Kufi stones does not contain Tura limestone. We compared the composition of natural limestone samples from quarries of Tura and Madi with stones from the pyramid of Khufu, and we discovered a number of anomalies. First observation: the composition of the stones of the pyramids is much more complex than those of official quarry stones. Certain micro-constituents of these stones show traces of a fast chemical reaction that didn't allow them a natural crystallization. An inexplicable reaction if the stones were cut, but perfectly understandable if we admit that they were made like concrete. So that confirms the thesis defended for 30 years by the inventor of geopolymers, the French chemist, also an Egyptologist, Joseph Davidovits. A few moments later, they open the valves and the concrete pours from the edge of the bowl. The workers have already measured and set up the mold at the bottom of the bowl, which will create the south underground tunnel. The concrete just has to flow around it. They will use the same principle for the underground chamber. The mold has been put in place and the concrete was poured around and over it. Workers took less care for the walls of the underground chamber than for the top of the pyramid. This concrete contains much less water than that of the upper part of the pyramid. When the mold is removed quickly and it has not had time to dry, it gives this rough appearance. The Egyptians never dug underground chambers or corridors below the pyramids since it's impossible. They simply filled it in. May the archaeologist Mark Lerner rest assured, the workers did not suffer. They worked in the open air and in good conditions. The cavity was then filled with limestone concrete. This explains the high precision of the South Underground Tunnel, the service tunnel, but also the sharp edges of the tunnel in this photo of Edgar Weiss in 1910. The Egyptians used the same method to build the descending tunnel and the well shaft. They established a formwork structure like this, the diagonal of two squares, which gives an angle of 26.57 degrees, which will also be used for the tunnel. This same structure will be used 3 to 4 years later to make the ascending corridor and for the Grand Gallery. They continued the molds and construction of the well shaft simultaneously. The walls of the well shaft have support notches for workers' feet, so that they could come down and come out of the pyramid when it was complete 13 years later. Thus they arrive at the level of the cave known as the grotto. At this level, they left a cavity and a block of granite to plug the well shaft behind them. The workers pour the first blocks of the pyramid. The volume of the cavity is estimated at around 450,000 cubic meters. That is not much compared to the 2.6 million cubic meters remaining. The workers are now approaching the surface. A fourth passage is opened to speed up the work. The work is divided into two work sites. Some mix and others fill. In order to free up the space of the pyramid, the ground limestone is made into concrete and poured in the center. The land beneath the platform of the pyramid is fully graded. Filling the cavity took approximately 3 years based on calculated estimates. This technique of arranging natural cavities was used for all the pyramids. It is particularly evident in the Pyramid of Medum. Follow the lines. They now continue to fill the interior as well as the descending corridor simultaneously with the well shaft. This is the reason why we notice in the underground tunnel a part which is made in masonry stones, and part of the tunnel is made of natural limestone in perfect continuity. They start the ascending corridor. At this stage, 600,000 cubic meters of limestone concrete have been moved. Classic theory says that 3 granite plugs were stored in a large gallery to later be released and plug the entrance. There is no trace of friction or scratches on the walls. In addition, the walls are not smooth, which does not facilitate sliding. Blocks that descend as seen in animation cannot slide in real life. A photo taken in the 50s and 60s totally contradicts the fact that the 3 granite plugs were released from the large gallery. The 3 granite plugs were poured and then stored there next to the entrance. Yes, you heard right. Poured. Making a simple cut-stone tunnel is too complicated. However, it is logical to create it with concrete. Poured into a form, it takes any form, and they can keep the angle precisely. They start the northern shaft and stop every few meters. The workers build the southern shaft, then fill it. They cover the horizontal corridor and the middle chamber. The filling continues to a certain level on the other side to the south. It's time to close the first passages. The passages of the extremities are blocked first, from top to bottom. The wooden mold comes from the ground level. The frame is supported by the beams. The workers fill the mold with limestone concrete from the ground. A few moments later, they continue with the next stone. This is the method that was used to close the siding throughout the construction. They build the floor of the large gallery in continuity with the ascending corridor. The pyramid continues to fill up, and they reach the ground level of the king's chamber. Then, using the solar lens, they pour the first floor of the king's chamber and the harrows in Aswan red granite. The harrows are planned based on the location of the wooden beams. The last block of the floor is in a V-shape to let the ropes for the carriage mold to pass. A few days later, once the walls had cooled, they removed the clay. The construction of the room lasted 3 to 4 months. Cutting granite to make such perfect walls in that time is just inconceivable. However, it is entirely possible with molten granite. The northern tunnel of the king's chamber makes a detour. Then construction stops at the gallery level. The ceiling beams are cast in turn. Egyptians had the innovative idea of making the Grand Gallery corridor in an inclined corbelled arch. The model was taken from the Red Pyramid and the Pyramid of Medum. This time the gallery is on an incline and not horizontal. All of this was planned from the start. To carry out the cantilevering of the Grand Gallery, they built an extraordinary wooden movable carriage mold. Here is the carriage mold. The movable mold is fixed to the ground in the notches on the floor. It measures 8 meters high with 7 levels. These 7 levels were used to complete the formwork mold on one side. The exterior side was completed with standard formwork molds. They start building from the bottom up. The movable mold is in place. They close the mold on the other side and then pour limestone into it. They continue like this for the upper floors. They pour the last block and the ceiling. At the same time, the rest of the team can continue to fill on either side. While the limestone is drying, workers install copper notches. This explains yet again that it is limestone concrete and not cut stones. Structurally, these copper notches hold nothing. The Egyptians knew this very well. The bench seat is not completely dry when the carriage mold passes, which explains the traces of wood found by Jean-Pierre Houdin. Houdin found a kind of elevator. The carriage mold had a counterweight to lift the stones. According to Houdin, it traveled back and forth. In truth, the carriage made only one pass from the bottom to the top, and it was much larger. Construction of the Grand Gallery progresses, and workers continue to fill it on the side and from above. As each part is built and filled, the workers pull the wooden carriage mold from the top of the platform, continuing cubit by cubit. The Grand Gallery is almost finished. The dimensions of the king's chamber are 10 cubits by 20 cubits and 11.18 cubits high. Some may assume that the simple-minded Egyptians said to themselves, "Let's make the king's chamber 2 simple cubes side by side, and that's that. Nothing special." Really? Indeed, it is this little 11.18 cubits which makes us once again discover in a spectacular way the scientific level reached by the Egyptians. The 4 universal constants, pi, golden ratio, royal number, and meter, are merged in the most perfect and incredible way. If we connect the corners of the room with lines, we discover that the perimeter of the room is 31,416 meters, or pi in tenths of a meter. The sum of the 3 sides of this triangle is equal to 52.36 cubits, the royal constant. This triangle is the sacred triangle of Isis, 3, 4, 5. And now, forget the units of measure, the meter, the cubit, the inch, the yard, the mile, etc. The Egyptian idea is to express the number 100 by building the room with 100 stones. They selected 7 numbers used to obtain a total of 100 stones. They calculated their square roots. Then the golden ratio, phi squared, multiplied by the square root of 4, 5, 9, 16, 20, 21, 25. In order to show us 4,500 years later that these equations are correct, using the results of these equations, they built the room in meters. This demonstrates that the king's chamber is built directly with the sacred standard, the universal, the centimeter. This is the scientific level of the Egyptians. Here is what we know, they tell us. They did not engrave the equations in hieroglyphs, but instead used mathematics to express their knowledge. Here, everything is made of unalterable granite, so that this message does not move by 1 millimeter over time. The pyramid is indeed a cenotaph for the soul, a spiritual monument where the meter, the royal constant, pi, golden ratio, chemistry, time, mathematics, astronomy are all inscribed. A souvenir for generations to come. The king is dead. A large public ceremony takes place for all the people. The king's body is lowered into the underground chamber to symbolize procreation in the belly. It corresponds to a specific ritual. The position of the sun is exactly facing the king's sarcophagus. The king is waiting for Ra in his chamber. The Egyptians aligned the city of Teotihuacan with, now you know it. The city was aligned at 14 degrees 7, not with the north, but with the southwest, with Betelgeuse, Alnilam and Rigel, passing through the hemisphere's axis on November 20th in the Egyptian royal cubit. Not one stone from the magnificent walls of the sites of Ollantaytambo, Pisa, Cuzco, or Sacsayhuaman were cut. These sites were built by Afro-Egyptians with the solar lens. After their departure, the Incas continued to maintain them, but with a rudimentary technique. The technological gap is obvious. The Temple of the Sun, Korinkancha, a masterpiece, is also made of molten volcanic andesite stone. There too, a surprise awaits. Melted at 600 degrees Celsius was mixed with the volcanic ash and added to sodium silicate to make the moais with the paste obtained. The unfinished moai in molten andesite and the unfinished Aswan obelisk in molten granite bear the fingerprint of the same artist. Beyond the molten stone walls which resemble those of Machu Picchu in Peru and the Khafre temple in Egypt, there is further evidence that the Egyptians were on the Easter Island. The meter. The Ahu Tongariki base, upon which the 15 moais are placed, is precisely 100 meters. The entire large roadway measures 220 meters. The builders of these monuments deployed the meter to the end of the world. It is inconceivable that a native population on a lost island at the end of the world needed to use the meter and that they discovered it. Over the years, the Egyptians circumnavigated the world several times. Sometimes accidents occur. No, you're not dreaming. Their boats ran aground in Gosford, Australia. The 500 hieroglyphs found there are referenced. There is no error. The grammar is... The pyramid can now be closed. This pyramid and its symbolism were to remain closed for eternity in privacy. Leaving with the remains, the workers closed the room with granite blocks provided for this purpose. The workers leave a dolerite ball and a copper hook as a souvenir in the middle chamber. Then they plug the holes. They move the 3 granite plugs to close the entrance and fill in the empty space around them. They take the exit from the well shaft built 15 years earlier. They descend to the level of the grotto and place the block of granite behind them. They descend to the basement, and they close the underground chamber with another block of granite. They climb to the surface. Outside, they lay the facing stones on their way and seal the entrance. And so, the pyramid is closed.
The Egyptians were called Kemets, and Egypt was called Kemet, the land of the black. No, it is not the black color of the Nile silt, which is mentioned as some archaeologists claim, but the color of the skin of the people living there. The race could survive shirtless more than 4 days without experiencing a severe skin burn. The only race capable of withstanding days and months without problem and without sunscreen is the race with black skin. Let's give back to the Egyptian what belongs to the Egyptian. The Egyptians of the pyramid for millennia were neither olive-skinned nor mulatto, but charcoal black.
In at least 2590 BC, Hedda, a court scientist, saluting these companions who were going towards Lebanon to look for oak wood, noted that the boats disappeared after a few minutes, diving below the horizon. However, the distance is not great. The human eye looks much further. He realized the extraordinary. The Earth is round. Expeditions were prepared. The Egyptians then left to explore the Earth. They knew that they cannot get lost. Since the Earth is round, they can always return to the starting point. The Egyptians knew navigation systems and infallibly mastered orientation. They had tools for universal measurements of distance and time, the stopwatch. The boats were fast and efficient. They were equipped to go discover the world.